Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatiron's Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatirons.tuning.com and stay tuned with Flatiron's Tuning.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Flatiron Syndicate Podcast. We are here today with some special guests. We have got Lance Lucas and Billy Brooks from Cobb Tuning, and you're joining us on the podcast. And guys, because this is your first time on the podcast, and some of the folks out there might not be familiar with you guys, can you first just introduce yourselves? And Lance, we'll maybe start with you. Just, what do you do with Cobb Tuning? How long have you been there? That sort of thing.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, John. So he said my name is Lance. I've been with Cobb now for, I guess, 15 years. It'll be in September. So, gosh, that's crazy. My current role is that I help oversee our Pro Tuner network. So those are people who use our business software to do commercial tuning activities for customers, and then also help support our event and trade show activities. So travel around to our I don't know how you would describe them, but the wicked big meets and that sort of
Oh,
thing,
yeah.
as well as our trade shows like SEMA and PRI. And then the thing I do that's kind of exciting is a lot of Subaru calibration, including the recent Flex Fuel project.
Oh, very cool. Nice. Billy, how about you? How long have you been working with Cobb? What do you do there?
So thanks again, John, for having us on. So I have been at Cobb since 2006, so going on, I guess, 18 years in September.
Wow.
Started out as running a dyno facility out at Miller Motorsports Park.
Oh,
Did
yeah.
some calibration, some hard parts engineering for the last probably 14 years, and then now I'm the chief technical and compliance officer here at Cobb. So oversee all our engineering efforts and then our compliance efforts. So
Okay. Very
yeah,
cool. Well, and the motivation to reach out to you guys to bring on is the fact that you guys have now released another group of the NexGen Flex Fuel system for I think it's basically most of the direct injected WRXs, the 2015 to 21. I don't think you've got the
yeah.
24 yet, but it's coming. And I wanted to talk to you about the Flex Fuel system specifically because it's really interesting what you guys have been able to do to get it back online, to make it available again. So I want to dive into that. But before we do that, let's back up for some people that maybe are not that technical, not that familiar with how your systems work, specifically the Accessport and the Flex Fuel system. So as a start, with the Accessport, it's basically it's a tool that allows you to reflash the ECU. But can you guys just kind of explain what does that mean? Like if you're plugging an Accessport into your car, what is it actually doing?
That's a great question. So I actually rolled over
Yeah,
to grab one. I got one right here,
yeah,
access port unit. So like you said, it's a handheld reflash device. So for a Subaru, what it allows you to do is read the stock ECU and kind of identify it. And then the access port communicates with the ECU to reflash a new calibration. And that calibration could be something that we created as part of our OTS map suite, or that could be a custom calibration, maybe from one of your guys there in Colorado or somewhere even across the world.
yeah.
So, and then beyond that, once the calibration is flashed, it has the ability to take data logs, read and clear a check engine light if you experience any trouble, measure some performance basic monitoring. Gosh, I believe there's like a quarter mile test and a horsepower estimate, some things like that as well.
Yeah. Now, and specifically relevant to the flex fuel system, when you're saying recalibrate the ECU, so you have the access port that plugs into the ECU, and basically it communicates and it resets some of the parameters in the ECU, but it's hard saved into the ECU because then once the reflash is done, you can disconnect the access port. The recalibration is there. It's on the ECU permanently until you go back in there and change it again, right?
Yeah, absolutely correct. So the one of the benefits of the access port is you can be very laissez-faire with it. You can be the guy who uses it one time, says great, puts it in his glove box, or you can be the guy who uses it every single day, takes data logs, reviews them at night, that sort of thing. So it sort of can be as detailed or as simple as you choose to be.
For sure. And when we're talking about a recalibration, it's commonly referred to as a tune or tuning the car. But the calibration is basically how the engine runs. So the access port is basically going in and it's saying, hey, instead of this boost pressure, let's set it to this boost pressure. Or if you're going to use this much timing, well, let's change the timing. There's all those kind of running parameters of how the engine works, how the engine runs. That's what you have. The Accessport gives you the gateway to go in there and adjust or recalibrate, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we're taking OEM data tables, like you said, maybe a boost target table or an air fuel ratio target table, and then modifying that data to something more desirable for whatever goal we're trying to accomplish. Beyond that, we also apply a lot of what we call custom code. So that's basically where we're adding features to the ECU or car that it didn't come with from the factory.
Right.
A big obvious one that everyone usually understands is launch control and flat foot shifting. The cars don't come with that from Subaru, so we add some custom code to make that happen. And then
Okay.
and then the Accessport actually usually also offers adjustments for that. So the customer can use the Accessport to say modify the launch control threshold RPM.
Yeah, brings more functionality. So you're somehow you're able to add code or basically add functionality to the ECU that it didn't come with from the factory. So that's another benefit of what the Accessport does.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, it really depends on the ECU and what available space we have to be able to add to determine what features can be added. So some ECUs have more space, some have limited space, and we really have to be selective on what we can add based off the feature sets that we like to do.
and that's in part due to the OEM manufacturers or time, because I know as cars have gotten, well, as time has gone on, the older cars, the ECUs are a little bit more outdated. They're not as capable as the ECUs that they're putting in the newer cars, right?
Certainly, yeah. And then, just a simple fact of they never accounted for our interests, right? They spec in OEM ECU based on what they need to accomplish for emissions or performance or otherwise, and then we're sort of left to play in the margins, and that's the fun part of the game.
For sure. So flex fuel. So let's talk about what flex fuel is. Like, I mean, the simple answer is it's the ability to run pump gas or just straight gasoline, or something like E85, which is up to 85% ethanol blended with gasoline. Why is that important? Why would anybody want to put E85 in their cars?
For most people in our segment, it's going to be for performance. So E85 has a couple big obvious benefits. One is going to be that it has a big cooling effect. So people would say it's a lot more resistant to knock. And then it also just simply has a lot higher octane rating. So it's a lot more resistant to knock in that fashion as well. And so you're able to tune the car more aggressively or operate it, aggressively for a longer period of time without risk or with much lower risk.
And because of that detonation resistance and because of the cooling.
Yes.
I know that on our car that we race up Pikes Peak, we have found like cooling is always a challenge up there. And now that we've switched to running ethanol on E85, we immediately saw an improvement just because it just cools better than gasoline. There's a lot of benefits to it. Subarus tend to like it. There's a lot of other cars, especially direct injected cars, high compression, or cars that have high compression turbocharged engines. They seem to do really well on E85 from what we've seen. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything anything kind of high strung or anything that is kind of on the edge of knock because of its performance rating or because it's a performance vehicle. Almost always increasing octane is a good thing, and when you can do it for $3 a gallon, that's great.
For sure. Yeah, compared to race gas, which is now, gosh, $12, $15 a gallon. It's race gas has gotten crazy expensive. So yeah, E85, like running E85 versus race gas at this point, it pays for itself. So yeah.
And
Well, go ahead, Billy.
it's not to say that like you can get a custom tune right now for E85. Like the only difference really from a flex fuel side is the fact that you can put any variation of ethanol content in the vehicle, ranging from 10, which is what you typically see in gas now, to 85%
Right.
that we get. And the best thing about that is the fact that you go to an E85 station, it's very rare that you're actually getting 85% ethanol. You're getting some variation of 60 to 75% or thereabouts, and it varies really pump station to station, state to state,
And through the year.
So, yeah.
Yeah, they change the blend in the winter usually. And so that I guess the next key point here is that running 85, because it's a different fuel, it requires a different calibration. And so in the old days, before something like Flex Fuel was available, you had to have your pump gas tune and your E85 tune or ethanol tune, and you could run one or the other, but that was it. And so whichever one you had on your car, that's the fuel that you had to put in the car, period. And if you, so like to your point, Billy, if you had an E85 tune, like let's say you were tuned to like 85% ethanol, and you go to the pump and there's 60% ethanol, that could be a little bit that could be a challenge where that calibration now is not going to be functioning properly. The car's not going to be running correctly because the fuel in the tank is not what the car is calibrated to run on, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So this is where flex fuel comes in. So flex fuel, there were some OEM manufacturers for a period of time were actually making their cars flex fuel compatible, which means to what you said, Billy, you could put in pump gas or E85 or any blend thereof, and the car would just figure out how much ethanol content you had in the fuel, and it would adapt the calibration accordingly, right?
Yeah, yeah. GM was the most popular in doing that, and that's where like a lot of these Continental sensors are really GM used in GM vehicles that then are used and repurposed by the aftermarket to utilize for other kits, either monitoring ethanol content or using for a flex fuel system like what
Sure.
we're doing. So
Sure. So for a car that likes to run on E85 but was not from the factory, I don't think any Subaru ever came from the factory's flex fuel capable right out of the box. Why would you want that? Why did you guys decide you wanted to add that functionality to the Subarus?
yeah, so I mean, we had a lot of customers that were tracking vehicles, putting vehicles in different configurations that had some either cooling issues or they wanted to make some more power and were but didn't want to put a bunch of additional aftermarket parts on the car, larger turbos, whatever. And ethanol became more popular in the marketplace, and especially in the aftermarket space, where it's there became more of a need for something that could handle the variation in ethanol content that people were seeing, because it wasn't very consistent. It was really inconsistent unless you were getting like barrels from VP or somebody where you could really understand, this is always going to be 80% or 85%. And to Lance's point, there's a lot of benefits of running E85 in a higher performance application, like what you guys are doing with Pikes Peak or Time Attack, or where you can kind of combat some of those, typical issues that you would experience with, temperature, water temperature, oil temperature issues, in ultimately just getting, more performance out of the vehicle, higher horsepower, higher torque. So, we wanted to be able to offer something that, could allow a customer to kind of take those capabilities and use them to their advantage in whatever application they might have, by offering a system of a combination of, an ethanol sensor, a module to be able to convert that information down to what the ECU could read, and then software to be able to take that information and allow the engine itself to be able to adapt to whatever ethanol content it would be. Obviously, there's limitations in the Subarus, depending on the vehicle that you're doing. With the EJs, they need larger injectors.
Yeah.
The GITs can get away with it without really having to do that. But yeah.
And the biggest significance from like an owner standpoint is it makes it so much easier to live with a car that if you can get E85 whenever, you can put it in there. But if it's hard to get, if you can, maybe you just get it at the track, or it's, something once a week, you can go out there and get, fill up the tank with it. You can just totally do that. Whatever, fuel you want to put in the tank, the car will just compensate and runs properly the whole time.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the big thing for most people is typically if you don't have the flex capability, people are also using some form of ethanol calculator, like a phone app, or
Yeah.
maybe manual pen and paper at the gas pump each time, or they're having to wait to fill the car at some specific level, quarter tank or third tank or something like that. And the flex capability is you can fill with any fuel you want at any level, and the car will automatically just flex to that and go.
Yep. And what's most interesting is the sensor, the wiring, the functionality. The cars didn't come with that, at least in the case of the Subarus. And so you guys had to add the sensor, connect all the wiring, get all the data to the ECU, reprogram the ECU so that it could actually use this information and then function this way.
Mhm.
Do you guys remember when you first came out with the first flex fuel systems? How long ago that was?
Oh gosh.
And
It was a while ago.
yeah, I want to say maybe like 2010s time
That I
frame.
was thinking 2010, 2011. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it was definitely with the GR, like, but I can't remember
I
exactly.
think our first flex fuel product would have been like 2016.
2016. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but still a while ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing is it kind of showed how much possibility there was with being able to get into the ECU and reprogram it, because you're adding all of this functionality that didn't exist there. But and what happened is there was an April 22 update that came through that people that are watching, you've probably heard of it as green speed, and we're not going to dwell on that. But the access that you guys had to the ECU to be able to make these big significant changes went away. And so because flex fuel was such a big change to the functionality of the ECU, and in part because of the wiring and the inputs that it was using to get this functionality to work, the access to that went away. That's where flex fuel kind of was off the table for a little bit. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
It was on pause.
On pause. So, and we're not going to dwell on that update, but when that came through, like, what did you guys initially think? Like, when that mandate came down, were you just like, all right, well, that is the end. We don't have as much access to make this work. It's gone. There's no bringing it back, or did you guys, was that not what you guys thought?
No, I think we always had a plan to bring it back. And kind of some of the backstory would be that in the past we had dabbled with some CAN-based products, like for the GTR platform. And that product was actually sort of a POC in that sense of that it was a start with a small kind of niche vehicle in a niche market and start developing that product and then see how it might lend itself to a bigger, more mass market like the WRX and STI. And so it was more or less just an issue of timing that we weren't ready with that product yet by the time we had to start making some of those changes. And so that's where the pause element came into play.
Sure.
Yeah, and the flex fuel kits that we initially offered for the Subarus, that kit actually went through a couple of revisions too, in between from inception to when we made the ultimate change with the new design in 2023 with the STIs, and then more recently with the CAN gateway setup and the DITs, where we've had to make evolutional changes based off just things that we wanted to re-implement into the vehicle to be able to control different things and whatnot. We were going through the TGVs on the STIs because the communication that some of the Subarus has evolved from like K-line to CAN, and not everything has CAN. So we ultimately had to have a separate solution that could do K-line, and that was really the initial device that we had in the initial solution that we had, and CAN really wasn't the initial thought process. And we really wanted to do dabble. We wanted a CAN solution, and we started dabbling with that, back in like 16, 17 on the GTRs, and then released a CAN gateway module for the GTR. But we knew it might not be necessarily price conscious, I guess, when we came out with it first. Thus the reason for kind of doing it in a market that could maybe absorb a little bit more, as the component costs were more. I mean, I feel that it was always our intention to move to CAN module on anything that we were doing flex fuel for in the future. It was just a matter of time, like how soon we had to implement it. And that's when we made some changes to the software, and ultimately we made a change on how we wanted to make it all work so that we could be more compliance side, it kind of made it so that we had to do it a little bit quicker than we intended. So
Sure. Now, Billy, can you just we mentioned CAN network, CAN bus a handful of times. Why was that one of the options to get this system to work again? And what is a CAN bus, and why might that be a useful tool to get Flex Fuel back online?
I'm going to let Lance talk about that a little bit
Okay.
more than I can. So.
Well, so like Billy was mentioning, basically our previous iterations of the product for Subaru relied on the TGV inputs. And so that's an analog input into the ECU. Unfortunately, though, it's one of the ones that the factory ECU uses for monitoring one of the sensors the car comes with stock. And basically the precedent has been set that you can't interrupt or manipulate an OEM signal. And so what that means is finding a new mousetrap for getting the information we need to the ECU, but without interrupting any of those signals like we did previously. CAN bus is, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in it either, but it's a little bit just like your home network, like Ethernet, where it's scalable in the sense of that you can add or remove certain devices without interrupting the integrity of any of the others. And so unfortunately, though, kind of like back to my point earlier, is that Subaru doesn't intend for us to do that. They don't
Right.
they don't add in the owner's manual, here's how to add 5 sensors to your car, just plug them in here. And so the ECU doesn't have code to deal with that. The car doesn't have any just spare connectors for plugging things into or otherwise. So it's still quite a big technical challenge.
Yeah.
Typically when the CAN communication on a car, you have a CAN high signal and a CAN low signal. And that's really when most of the sensors that are connected to the network, they're using the high and the low signal to communicate the information to the ECU. And as to Lance's point, it allows for more information to be put on that network without interfering with analog signals, where it's just got one line, like on your typical boost gauge, where you have like a power, ground, and a signal wire. Like if you interrupt that signal wire, then you're not allowing that boost gauge to work,
Right.
and you're repurposing it to something else. Whereas on a CAN network, you can add additional information to that network and not take away from something else working the way it wasn't intended to work.
And because the ECUs have developed through the years, like for one, I think the first Subarus that had CAN was 2006 or 2007, was it? Like there was a partial CAN.
Yeah.
And then the CAN bus became a standard, I think, in 2008. So kind of from 2008 on, I think that's where most of the cars have some form of this CAN network built into them. From your standpoint going forward, is that going to be a requirement for all the flex fuel options? Is like, does the car have to have a CAN system from the factory to make this a possibility?
Yes and no. These days, I believe CAN is not even the current networking systems that like the latest and greatest manufacturers are using. I'm sure Subaru still is, but I know there's other networking systems available, and basically those will be the technologies that we have to keep pace with. Is what are they doing in terms of networking and data sharing amongst the various devices in the car?
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a requirement necessarily. It just makes it easier for us to be able to get ethanol or like a flex fuel system to work. But as we've been able to show with the STI system, the NexGen STI system, we can get it to work on K line or some other way without needing to have CAN as a necessity. It just makes it more challenging. So
Gotcha. Well, and for the new direct injected WRXs, the latest flex fuel system that has come out, there's a CAN box that's part of it. So what is different about the newer direct injected cars that requires that? Is that the portal to get into the network, or?
It's not necessarily that it requires it. I guess the big difference in the two existing products, kind of the EJ versus FA, is that for EJ, we wanted to stick with the TGV based system because it still could theoretically scale back to older cars that didn't yet have CAN. So the '06 Foresters or the '06 STIs of the world. it's theoretically still possible to support those cars with the product we have out for the STI today. The FAWX has never had, or has always had CAN bus, I should say, and so there's no reason to adapt to an older FA style or otherwise. So that's just sort of kind of just based on the engine family, if you will.
Okay.
Because developing features for them is kind of similar within a family. And developing flex fuel for one EJ is much more similar to developing for the next EJ than it is for an FA.
Okay. So once you kind of get it for one, it's easy to adapt for other cars.
Easier, yeah.
Yeah, and in the module really is just it's almost like it's its own computer that's effectively taking whatever's plugged into that module and identifying what signal it is, how it's being used, and effectively then pumping that through another connector into the ECU and using our working with our software to recognize that input from the new CAN module to be able to know what to do with it. So you can't just necessarily take an ethanol sensor and plumb it in on a Subaru.
Right.
Without having some way to convert that signal to something that the ECU can read. So like we have the module, the CAN module is that thing that converts it to something that the ECU can read for the DITWXs. And then the little box for the EJ setup is doing the same thing on the EJ side, or where it's just converting it to something that the ECU can read. Now there's other vehicles outside of Subaru, like Volkswagen per se, where there is open pins or in the ECU that where in Volkswagen they do have flex fuel setups, just not in the United States, but in Brazil. They run it from a factory standpoint, and it's just the U.S. market doesn't get that flex fuel sensor and doesn't get the wiring harness to pin it to the ECU. So it's already populated in Volkswagen, where we can just pin it to the ECU, whereas Subaru, it's not populated somewhere else in the world. So it's really having to make, custom things to make it work.
Okay. So now that you've got basically kind of the EJ platform and the FA platform back online, like I'm guessing obviously going forward, any new car you want to have flex fuel for, how far back are you going to go and maybe how quickly? Because I know that's one of the biggest questions for the older cars is how soon is flex fuel going to come back for them?
That's the $1 million question, I think.
Yeah.
Right now, I will say the priority is VB. So that'd be the 22 through 24 WRX. That work is ongoing right now, and that's part of my responsibilities is the calibration side. What happens after that is a good question. I am certainly an internal advocate of getting back to supporting the 04 through 07 STI or 05 through 07 STI again. The 08 through 14 WRX, I think, is the big other question that people usually have, and that project is ongoing internally as well. So
okay,
I can't speak to timing.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So when we re-released our first new NexGen setup in 2023 with the STI, it was 15 to 21 STI. Then we followed up with an 18 to 14 STI.
Yep.
Then we recently released the 15 to 21 WRX. And then to Lance's point, the 22 and newer WRX is currently being worked on with a CAN module. And then the 08 to 14 WRX is currently being worked on utilizing that EJ NexGen module.
Okay.
And then from there, once we get through that, those two platform or vehicles will reevaluate where we go from there, whether we can have the workforce to be able to incorporate in the older models and how soon we can get those older models done, or whether we need to push it out a little bit to get those other ones. I mean, ultimately, we do want to support anything that we had the old modules for and were removed at the bare minimum. So
Sure.
Anything new beyond that for older vehicles is really still in question, but we do want to get at least the coverage that we had before taken care of. And then obviously the new WRXs. And then from there, it's really up in the air.
Gotcha. So question for both of you, because basically you never had a system for the 22 and up WRX, the FA24 WRX, and you're now starting with it fresh. Is it completely different than what worked for the FA20 WRX, or is it like you kind of alluded to this, Lance, that it's somewhat related, but how big of a challenge has it been to make flex fuel work on that FA24 engine?
So that's a good question. I would say the hardware was always kind of designed with the intent that it would carry forwards into new models. So we're actually able to reuse the bulk of the hardware that we developed for the 15 through 21. So that's a great thing about this product, is it's fairly scalable for us in the sense of it may require some small tweaks, be it to wire harnesses, maybe a small firmware change, but the platform itself allows us to build fairly quickly. The challenging part is always developing the custom code for the ECU to make it do the flex things, and then developing a calibration that we can put through the emissions compliance process and pass.
Okay. Now, I mean, I'm sure a question you guys get, especially at the meets and stuff like that, is why is it so hard? Like, why does it take so long? Like, if you figured it out for a couple of these cars, when the new version comes out, like how much, like why does it take so much effort to get in there and make it work for, like, say, a 22 WRX versus a 21 WRX? Is it just that each one of those steps that you just mentioned, Lance, are like those are not little things, those are big things, or is it more than that?
Yeah, in a sense that, when you say it in one or two sentences, it certainly sounds simple, but that's really not the case. As it relates to Subaru keeps things fairly straightforward compared to, say, maybe like a Volkswagen or a Porsche, where they've got some crazy number of ECU variants or ROM variants for each year. But even with that, even with Subaru's simplicity, it's still very difficult. The OEM code isn't written with the intent of somebody else coming in later and changing it around a bunch, or adding an entirely set of duplicated tables to then use as a high and low blend, like what we do for flex fuel. Each model year it changes. They may introduce new code. They may change the factory calibration. Over time, what we refer to as like the operating system, it may change, and then the code that we have to write for it is different than the old code that we had to implement or otherwise. So if you want to just do it for, say, one vehicle, a manual transmission 2022 WRX, not so difficult. Now, all of a sudden, if you want to support every transmission type across 3 or 4 model years, the challenge is exponential.
Gotcha.
And
Well,
I wish everything was easy, because
sure.
it definitely does sound easy when you say, oh, just put a module on the FA and 24 and it can work. And to Lance's point, the majority of it will transfer over. But the CAN communication lines isn't through every sensor on a vehicle, and there's certain connectors or certain modules that use CAN and others that don't. And so over the years, just a simple thing is like the connector, like 15 to 21 WRX, we actually have 2 vehicle specific wiring harnesses, because the connector changed halfway between 15 to 17 was one connector, and 18 to 21 was another style connector, in the way that we were inputting the information into the vehicle. And then again in 22, it changed a different connector. So we're having to redo a harness to get the information into the vehicle. And then, just as much as it is difficulty in getting rewriting the software to get it into the ECU, to be able to communicate back and forth, even the difference between a 22 model year and a 23 model year is security is different. So like there's gateways in a lot of these newer vehicles where you have to get through the gateway to actually be able to communicate to the ECU, and that getting through that gateway changed between 22 and 23, and then it changed between 23 and 24. So there's a lot of work that our reverse engineer guys and our computer engineer guys and software guys have to do figure out how to get the information from the tune actually being put in the vehicle to the ECU and getting it to stick into the ECU.
So you guys are it even if Subaru says nothing changed from like one model year to the next or even over a group of model years, you guys kind of have to start over every different model year, maybe even a couple times in each model year to make sure that if you have a product that you say is for 2016, it's going to cover all of the 2016 WRXs, manual transmission, automatic transmission, whatever. Any of those cars, you've got support for it.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to too, anytime Subaru gives us gives new updated ROMs or whatnot for vehicles, then it's a new investigation to understand, okay, what is it going to take to support that ROM? Because obviously they want people on the newest version, and we want to be able to support that newest version because we don't know exactly what Subaru has changed. It's a new an engineering effort to understand the time frame to support that new ROM and get everything working. And it could be right in the middle of Lance doing model year 24 support. A new ROM comes out for 21 WRX or 15 to 21 WRX that we then have to decide, okay, how quickly do we need to support that ROM or whatnot? Or even when Lance is working on 24 WRX, the ROM that he's working on could be out of date next week, and because Subaru's putting the new ROM, and then we have to not necessarily completely start over, but try to understand what has changed and kind of go from there.
Sure. So it's complicated. Like the simple answer is to say it's complicated. It's more complicated than you probably thought.
Yeah, there's even some behind the scenes stuff that happens. So for like the 15 through 21 WRX, that car, its factory emissions rating changed over time. So if you guys have heard terms like SULEV or LEV 2, LEV 3, that rating on that car changed over the course of its lifespan. And so that then requires kind of tracking a moving target in terms of what you're doing in terms of establishing emissions compliance.
Okay. Wow. Now that's talking about just kind of the nuts and bolts of getting the system on and like the base functionality. How much testing do you guys then have to do before you say, okay, we've found this solution, it seems to work, we're ready to release it?
Oh gosh, a ton. So the first step is always internal testing, and so that's a lot of testing all of those features we developed, that custom code for the ECU, the wiring harnesses and sensors and the firmware for the CAN gateway, all that sort of stuff. And then that's testing it on every model year, 15, 16, 17, etc. So, each one of those tests on its own is a couple weeks, and then you extrapolate that across a couple cars or a lot of cars. And so it's many, many months of internal testing, even just until we're confident to say that the product works, across everything we intend to support. And then the fun part starts, and that's the emissions testing portion. So.
Talk a little bit about what does that mean? What does that involve?
Billy, do you want to go a bit?
The emissions testing part is obviously it's sending a vehicle to a lab that can analyze exhaust gases coming out the tailpipe to understand if it's within the allowable limits that car has been certified to have. So pending the categories, as Lance said, with its LEV 2, LEV 3, SULEV, U or 75s, et cetera, there's different limits, like max limits that a car can emit out the tailpipe. And that max limit is really based off the useful life of the vehicle. So when an OEM goes to certify a vehicle to be able to release to the public, there's a useful life, they call it, which effectively is like from start to X amount of miles. This car has to stay within these emissions limits. Useful life for a Subaru is typically like 120,000 miles.
Okay.
When the car tests it new, it's obviously going to be pretty clean. in low emissions. When it gets to 120,000 miles, the cat's probably, clogged a bit, but it still should test within the max allowable limits of the vehicle.
Right. So this is what the OEs have to do, but now
Mhm.
you're having to, and I think this is kind of in the purpose of getting something like a CARB certification or
Mhm.
some kind of EO for a part or product, so that you can basically put your car with these modifications through the same testing like the OEs do or similar to that, so you can get that certification.
Yeah, so like the OEs definitely go more in depth. CARB has allowed for aftermarket component testing, and it's their process is not as in depth as an OE. So just to give you an example of like if you were to test for useful life on a vehicle from 0 to 120,000 miles, um, we got a quote for $500,000 to do
Whoa.
that testing. So it's getting a vehicle, sending it to a lab. They're driving it from 0 to 120,000 miles. They're doing emissions tests at every defined intervals that are set by CARB or the EPA in monitoring that across that whole time frame, and that came out to $500,000. And obviously, like a company, like an aftermarket company,
Yeah.
doesn't have the ability to pay for that. So
Well,
CARB is
is
allowed
that
for. Go ahead.
well, and that's for one model year, right? Like so if you like, let's say you guys decided 22 WRX, that's the one we're going to do this. That would only pertain to a 22 WRX, right?
It would only pertain to that model year group. So
Okay.
effectively like 22 to 24 or 15 to
Okay.
21. So
Okay.
as long as the major component tree of the vehicle hasn't changed, it would allow to encompass that group of vehicles.
Okay. So it's a
The
group, but not all
Not
carbs.
all.
the
Yeah.
challenge would be is if they made the standard more stringent, say for model year 2025 on the same engine family. And then you have to track that moving standard.
Yeah, to Lance's point, that is, I didn't mention that, but that is also another category or another part where you would have to go through that whole useful life determination.
Again.
And what Lance said, 15 to 21 has effectively 3 emissions categories between those model years of vehicles. So it's really, if we were to do it from an OEM standpoint, we'd be doing like useful life emissions testing in those 3 emissions categories.
Wow.
So
That's a huge investment.
yeah,
And
and it's not, CARB has created an avenue for aftermarket companies to be able to get EOs on a more cost-effective, platform and rollout. And everybody, CARB is kind of considered maybe a bad word, maybe not in our space. And really, it's because for as long as I've been to SEMA, there's always been an EPA meeting at SEMA where they talk about emissions and what we should be doing and how to do it. And there's always a communication of, well, how do you stay off your radar, EPA's radar, or something like that. And there's always, well, as long as you do reasonable basis or a CARB E.O. Now, reasonable basis might not, if you can provide information to show that you've done some type of testing that you can, that shows that it's good, you can provide that if CARB ever or EPA ever asked a question about it. But that might subdue them for now. But that doesn't mean that they might not come back around and ask more questions later.
Yeah.
Whereas a CARB E.O. is, kind of more solidified answer, I guess, or, we've done the
it's more
testing
of a
to.
definitive result.
Exactly. Sorry. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. So.
Yeah. Well, and so the question that I would throw out there is, why does it matter? And obviously at Cobb, it matters a lot to you guys because there are other aftermarket companies that have gotten CARB certifications for some things, going back historically. But after the April 22 update, you guys have really been aggressive in getting as many CARB certifications as you possibly can. So it clearly matters to you guys. Why? Can you give me an idea of why?
To put it simply, it matters for our existence. At the end of the day, the precedent has been set that the liability is on the manufacturer to produce products that can be legally used. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been following along, but the EPA has come out in more recent times and made some pretty specific statements about legality of race cars and things like that. And this is the one clear way we know of to make sure that our products are established as legal, and that dealers like Flatirons and all the great customers out there can use them legally in either 50 or 49 state, kind of depending on the circumstance. The EPA has a website where they publish all of their enforcement actions each year against companies in our space. And if you start reading through them, there's a very clear precedent in terms of what they're focused on and the things they're not going to allow. And unfortunately, the liability is on us. And so we have to set the right path from the top, and then the customers and users below us are doing the right thing kind of by default.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're all car guys, car gals, gearheads. Like, we all want to be able to modify our cars. We all want to be able to do whatever we want with our cars. And there's always been, a Clean Air Act since 77, where, we've all kind of been maybe skirting a gray area or something like that. And we want to be able to continue modifying our cars. We want to be able to continue allowing customers to modify their cars. And for us, the CARB E.O is really the only clear way that we see currently to be able to allow that to continue, allow the ability for us to continue offering, our products to customers, and being able to do what they want with their vehicles, and continue to modify and continue to, expand upon their maybe steps along the way that they want to move their vehicle to. So, it's very important to us. So,
well, and I think it's really easy to get frustrated with it from an enthusiast standpoint, but I think as time has gone on, more people are realizing that it's just what you said. If we want to keep doing what we're doing, if we want to keep having the ability, we as enthusiasts, if we want to keep having the ability to go in and take a car and change it and get it to do something that we want to do that's outside of the box of the factory, especially from a power standpoint, having manufacturers that are putting in the time and effort to get these certifications, that's the key piece of the puzzle. Because in the background, what is happening is more and more states are making it so that you do not have carte blanche to go in and do whatever you want to your car and still drive it on the street. At this point, I mean, we're in Colorado, and I can tell you here in Colorado, things have changed as we as enthusiasts have figured out that they now can tell if you have a flash on the ECU that is not a certified flash, and they can actually prevent you from getting through emissions because they realize, oh, well, the mapping on your ECU does not match what it's supposed to. And even if you pass everything, all of the tests at the testing facility, you still fail because they know that there's a flash on the ECU. And now with what you guys are doing with the CARB E.Os, if you have a CARB E.O stage kit, you can go through and show them that and show them the documentation and finally get through it. It's not a smooth process for us here because there's still some bumps in the road, but it does work. I've had customers that have gone through everything, and it does work once you have all of the documentation in line.
That's great.
Yeah, it's I guess it provides customers maybe too a more peace of mind, like the fact that they don't have to worry about when their car comes up for inspection the next year, and if they're, depending on what their state situation is and what they look for. I mean, it's obviously, we've made the decisions that we've made to get to where we are and trying to be as have everything compliant. looking back, do we wish we would have done it a different way, or at least released it a different way and letting customers and dealers know more than
Sure.
yes. I mean, I can't say that we did it the right way. Obviously, we upset a lot of people, and obviously we're regaining the trust of our customer base and whatnot. And I can't say how I'm sorry for everything that we've done, and there's nothing that I can say to satisfy everybody, but we're definitely in the our focus is to be able to continue to keep aftermarket performance parts available to the customer base, to keep this community going. I know SEMA's been very active in trying to help with that as well. And it's just, it's very important to me to be able to modify my vehicle the way I want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
if we hadn't made the change we had made, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. So
yeah. I mean, I all I will say is, from an outsider looking in, at the initial onset, it seemed like a decision that had to be made. It's not something that wanted to be made that way. And it's pulling off the Band-Aid. But the thing that people have to remember is, I mean, we're trying to run a business here. You guys are trying to run a business there. And when you're running a business, you have to have more of a long-term point of view, long-term perspective. It's not just what's good for today or this week. You've got to look years down the road, and where you guys are at now, and with all of the CARB certifications and everything that you guys have got. I mean, it's we're hopeful that more companies will go down a similar path, because then I know that is going to work, that my customers are going to have good results with it. They're not going to have any surprise issues, when emissions time comes for them to run the car through again, because that's the path that we're on, and more states are making it that way. I wish we all had more freedom to pick and choose, but this is kind of this is the game that we're playing. And again, if you want to be able to buy another car and buy Cobb products in 5 years from now, this is kind of what we all have to do.
Yeah.
So to that end, I want to ask, because the flex fuel system is really neat, and it's really important to a lot of people, but it's something that currently does not have a CARB certification. Do you think that will ever have a CARB certification, or is that something that is just going to be a long-term challenge?
Want me to answer, or you answer? Yeah, so I guess maybe a little bit of background that might be helpful there is, so we have essentially two main paths that we use for formally establishing compliance. And one of those, like you mentioned, or like we've been talking about, is the CARB E.O. And the EPA essentially recognizes that as a 50-state stamp of approval. They'll never say it's approved, but that means it's a product that they condone for sale and that they consider to be legal. The second one that we use for flex fuel products is what's referred to as the SEMA certification, or SEMA emissions certification. And that's a program done through SEMA Garage. And what that does is it kind of follows the guidance that the EPA gave, I believe, in November of 2020, for how to establish reasonable basis outside of the CARB E.O process. And so for flex fuel, we pursue it through the SEMA certification, which is 49 state legality. The reason we do that is because CARB does not currently have an aftermarket path for a flex fuel product. So they've got a really big binder for how to test and evaluate all sorts of different products, an intake or whatever it might be, but they don't have a page for flex fuel. It's not in their processes list. So as it stands currently, if you were to go through their process, they would say, great, we need you to do that $500,000 testing that Billy was talking about earlier. You demonstrate, just like an OEM, that you have a reliable emissions testing or passing emissions product. So what the bridge we're trying to gap is to get to an aftermarket process within CARB. We've been working on that, and there's kind of what I would call like an unofficial consortium of companies kind of working on it, because they all have a vested interest in coming up with a way to do this. So that's companies like us that make tuning products or sell maybe fueling system components. SEMA Garage obviously has a vested interest because they want to find a way to get this out for the rest of their companies and customers and manufacturers. And then fuel manufacturers, they have a vested interest because they want to be able to sell ethanol. That GM doesn't necessarily sell all those flex fuel cars anymore, but maybe if some more Subarus get converted, then those ethanol companies have a good customer going forwards. So there's a lot of companies with interest in it, and we're all kind of unofficially teamed up to prod at CARB to try to make that happen.
So to get back, the long and short of it is, will it have a CARB E.O? Yes. When? Undetermined.
Undetermined.
We will, I'm 100% confident we will get to a point where we'll have a CARB E.O flex fuel kit. When that is still up in the air. I mean, to Lance's point, we've been working on this for at least since 2018, going back and forth with CARB, having conversations with them, trying to get to a point where we can get, a reasonable set of testing parameters that we need to complete and showcase that our stuff works and keeps it within the range it needs to be. The biggest question really is, surrounded about durability and how it's going to impact the vehicles over its useful life. And
this is from CARB's standpoint.
Yep. Yeah. And it's like, obviously we can go through and do the typical testing that we do for an intake or an intercooler, but there's still kind of not a complete understanding by them, and ultimately probably us too, like in the aftermarket, like, over time, how is this what's going to happen? I mean, we can look at fuel line construction and make sure it's ethanol safe, and replace things that aren't that way to make sure it stays for useful life. But it's really working with CARB to get to a point where we can get this durability question answered, that can allow us to continue on towards an E.O status. So,
and because I have to ask, you have sent, and you've got kind of the SEMA Garage certification for the flex fuel system, but you've done a lot of this testing and you've had a lot of tailpipe emissions evaluated at various different sets or different percentages of ethanol. What happens to emissions as you start adding ethanol into the fuel?
Oh, that's a good question. So it changes for sure. We have seen where the overall emissions on the vehicle as they evaluate it, right? So it's always how are you looking at emissions and how you're considering it. Some people consider pollution or emissions on like a global scale, right? Like planes, ships, cars, it's all one big thing. They look at it, on a very micro level. And so some of the pollutant components do get better when you add ethanol without making many other changes. Some of them can actually get a lot worse without some very specific calibration changes. And that is something that I didn't really expect kind of leading into all of that. Is I was kind of in that old school, like, oh man, ethanol, everyone's told me it's got to be cleaner. It's better, right? For sure. And it usually is. But if there's certain calibration changes that aren't done, it can actually be detrimental to the emissions profile of the vehicle.
So it can be better, but it's involved to get it to be like really burn cleaner and work better.
Yeah, there's some devil in the details situations. Like on our Volkswagen product, we have a flex fuel product for the Volkswagens, and there was a very specific portion of one of the tests involving a hot restart that was somewhat problematic for emissions, and that required some very specific calibration changes and many iterative tests to get to where we needed to be. And that's kind of that big time component. Each of those tests, all said and done, takes close to a week. By the time you have prepared them with an updated calibration, they prep the vehicle, drive it around, get mileage accumulation, load it onto their dyno, have it all soaked and ready, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, it's not like a quick power pull and then 20 minutes later you can try again. It's a once or twice a week iterative thing.
It's back to the question of why does it take so long?
Yeah,
there's a lot of testing that goes on. There's a lot of testing.
Yes, and each one of those, each time you say a test, that's a number ranging anywhere from $2,000 to $8,000. So there's a lot of expense.
Yeah, I mean, to give a long or a quick synopsis of what goes through testing. It's like you send a vehicle out, that company effectively clears the vehicle to make sure readiness monitors on the vehicle can set full readiness. They drive the vehicle around to the point where it gets full readiness on all monitors. And then at that point, they can start emissions testing. And they run through an FTP, an SCO3, a USO6. And those different tests kind of account for different operations of a vehicle, whether it's kind of cruising, it's your normal city driving, it's stop and go, it's cold starts, it's hot starts, trying to kind of take into account the majority of what people do on a daily basis, back and forth and whatnot. In you're redoing all those tests anytime you do a calibration change. So there's a lot of iteration done if we don't pass the emissions part of it. Say it doesn't pass for cold start, then Lance has to make a change, and then we have to start all over with everything and go through it all again. So
Oh, wow. A lot of testing. A lot of testing. Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, and do you think, would you say that there's an argument that could be made? Because Lance, you said that it can be worse, but you can correct for it a lot. Could this kind of be one of these things where we can ask them to meet the enthusiast base halfway of like, well, here's this fuel that does have some emissions benefits. Let us set up the cars to run on this fuel because it has these emissions benefits, because what you're concerned about is emissions. Do you think there's any leg to stand on there? Or?
I think there is, but I think that's what they would say their aftermarket process will be when they offer it. That's sort of that's what the Billy's point earlier is, that we only have to go through this subset of tests and not demonstrate, this full battery, I guess, like an OEM would. And so in their mind, they say, well, yeah, that's no big deal. You only have to pass once on ethanol and once on gasoline, and then you've proven it, good to go. But that's 6 months of work sometimes. And so they are receptive to data. Part of a submission or an update is oftentimes an engineering analysis or an explanation of something. So they might not say you need to prove something in a lab, but you need to write something up and explain why you've been led to this conclusion and why we should be too. And they will accept those, but it usually needs to be more specific than ethanol good type thing. So
Right. Well, I mean, just the simple fact that there is now the SEMA Garage and the SEMA Garage network that they're working with. I mean, it seems like that the progress is slow, but there is kind of progress that's happening a little bit in this direction.
yeah, I will say, in CARB's defense, you might be surprised to hear me say that phrase, but they have a lot of good people working for them, and at the SEMA show they came up to talk to us, and they basically said, like, we know we need to find solutions for getting these products legally onto the market, because if we don't, people will just do it illegally, and that's not our goal. So they kind of recognize that they do have to work with us to get where they want to be, and that's clean cars on the road, customers happy with what they own.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's hard being even a couple years in to think, to maybe come to this conclusion, but it's progress is happening. And it's like I said, Billy, you're confident that there will be CARB certification for flex fuel. It's just we don't know when. But I'm sure, like, if none of these changes were happening, you probably wouldn't be able to say that with any kind of confidence, because the changes aren't happening, but they are. The ball is starting to roll down the hill, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of changes happening is we developed a hydrocarbon trap intake for the Ford Raptor. And that was something that really hadn't been done before, in the fact that the hydrocarbon trap is not like for like. So we're not using the same hydrocarbon trap that the OEM uses. We're using a different form of a hydrocarbon trap that is used by an OEM, but it's not like a pouch. It's a paper media. It's whatever it might be. And we were able to get to a solution that CARB would accept. So progress is happening. There will be a solution for flex fuel at some point. It just when and how long So,
And honestly, just the fact that progress is happening, that's good because it means that at some point, if we're just patient, we will get there. And it's through the work that you guys are doing, which is what I'm sure it's not easy. I have no doubt that it's not easy. And there's a lot of just like straight up work that has to be done to get it across the finish line.
yeah. Yeah, and the patience part is always the hardest part.
Always,
So,
yes. Well, maybe to just as a last question here, because guys, thank you again for all your time. Really appreciate it. And I want to let you get back to whatever you guys were doing. But the CAN bus, using this CAN network as an option. Now that you guys have done this, you've figured it out, you've implemented it for the flex fuel system. Are there any other doors, any other possibilities that that method is now opening? Like, is it are some wheels turning about other ways to use this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the immediate obvious opportunity is adding extra sensors above and beyond just ethanol content. So some of the big common ones that people like to see if the car doesn't come with it might be something like oil pressure or oil temperature, or maybe on a little bit older car, a wideband O2 sensor setup so they can monitor fuel ratio more accurately. And the CAN gateway does have the ability to integrate analog extra sensors like that. So that's a immediate opportunity that we've got, I believe, one sensor already and a couple kind of in the works or on the whiteboard to bring to market. Beyond that, there's
Wow.
potentially some bigger picture stuff we could do in terms of triggering an external device. That's more theory than practice right now, but it does expand a lot of opportunities, like you're saying, that what we call I/O, input output to the ECU, give us more opportunities to either bring new stuff in or send a signal out to do something else.
Very cool.
yeah,
And
and
now,
it's
oh, go ahead.
just like I mean, the reason, just like I listened to you and Dewey on IAG's podcast about how you guys wanted to monitor crankcase pressure, I think it
Yeah.
was, for tuning, and it's like, well, the CAN gateway can or could do that. It could do it right now with the pressure sensor that we have, but it's a
Right.
0 to 100 psi pressure sensor, so it might not be the as accurate as you want it to be. So obviously, being able to working on getting other pressure sensor options where you can scale it based off the pressure sensor that you're using for whatever application you're using it for, to be able to get that into the ECU and be able to monitor it along with everything else that you're monitoring, RPM, whatnot. And just, sky's the limit. All additional injectors, maybe in the future. Yeah. So, I mean, there's options galore.
Even just from a data standpoint, like being able, because the Accessport it is a great platform to be able to record data and data log, for this simple device to be able to plug it in and be able to download that data. But like to have the ability to actually add a sensor or two, a couple of sensors, and add that data log to the data log. I mean, when we've transitioned to a standalone in the race car, and being able to data log all of that information has been a game changer. And I think with the Accessport, if you could add a couple sensors, like you're saying, oil temp, oil pressure would be huge. Honestly, crankcase pressure. If I had to add two, it would be oil pressure and crankcase pressure, but that's just me. That would give you an amazing ability to data log that, right now you have to go to a standalone to be able to see that in any kind of context like that. So just from a data standpoint, that seems very cool to me, for whatever it's worth.
All right, we got +1 on the request column.
Yes, +1. Check. Okay, perfect. Well, guys, we've run a little bit over, so I want to let you get back to it. But thank you again so much for your time. Thanks for being willing to talk about this topic, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there, and it's something that I'm very glad we were able to sit down and have this conversation. So
Yeah, thank you so much.
yes,
Yeah, I appreciate your time and getting us on. And obviously, this is probably going to create more questions. So maybe we can talk again another time on a different topic. So.
Leave them in the comments below, and we'll see what you guys say. And yeah, if we have to come back and address some of them or talk about them, that's not a problem. We can always do it.
Awesome.
So, well, thanks very much, you guys. Again, thanks to Cobb Tuning for all the stuff that you're doing. Thanks for making awesome products for decades and decades, and hopefully what you will continue to do for decades more. And to everybody at home, thanks for watching. Thanks for your support as always. And until next time, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatironstuning.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatiron's Tuning.